that we can start right at 7 o'clock, I just wanted to welcome you to Women's Night In. I think it's very nice that you're interested. And remember, it was women who asked for Women's Night In. It's why we have an adult program. So don't be shy of giving us ideas if you have something come up that you want to be sure and let us know about. We'd love to have a program. Just to make sure, too, it isn't monthly. It was falsely advertised that way. It is spring and fall. But we're open to more, so let us know what you want to know about. Tonight we have Mary McLain. I'm just going to let her come and tell a little about herself. There's some seats up here, ladies. And she's going to tell you about the Orphan Train Heritage Society that she belongs to, and then she'll have the program. Afterwards, I want to make sure you know that Cookies from the Heart donated the refreshments tonight, so we sure partake of that. I wanted to tell you, too, that this is the second program today that Mary has given. She wants questions, but go easy on her. So enjoy the program, have the refreshments, and remember the library is open until 8:30, so if you want to enjoy the library afterwards too. And the band concert is at 8, don't forget that. Mary?
Well, I'm Mary McLain, and my husband and I live in Urbandale, Iowa for 6 months of the year, and then we live in Mesa, Arizona, another 6 months. I guess you'd call me a nosy person. I worked for a newspaper for about 25 years. Not loud enough? I worked for a newspaper for about 25 years and really enjoyed that. And then we retired in about 1989. Is that better?
No.
Wait a minute. I may just hold this. That's going to be better, right? Okay. We've had to do that before, and that'll work. I'm going to talk to you tonight about one of America's best kept secrets. My husband and I belong to the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America, which is a national organization. And their main concern is with helping other people who have, other descendants who have writers, to try to find out something about their writer if they don't know anything about that person that rode the train from long ago. And they have the yearly conventions, and we will be going to the convention this September. And some of the stories that I will be telling you in a little bit are stories that writers at that convention have told me those stories themselves. And so we know that they are true stories. About 9 years ago this summer, my husband and I decided we would host an Iowa Orphan Train reunion. It would be just a one-time thing. And we had 100 people at that meeting, and they all had so much fun that they asked if we wouldn't do it again. And we've hosted it every year but 2 years. And this year it's going to be in Ames on August 2nd and 3rd. And if anyone is interested in attending this, if you'll see me afterwards, I'd be glad to give you a form to fill out. As I said, I am retired. I quilt and give speeches. That seems to be my two main hobbies right now. We have 6 grandchildren, and 3 of them arrived last night. And Grandma took off and is gone all day today. But they have another grandmother that lives right in the same town, so they were going to spend today with her. Okay, now we'll get on with the orphan train. Did you know that at least one of the orphan trains came to Fairfield, Iowa? Is there anyone in the audience that is a descendant of an orphan train rider? You are?
My husband.
Your husband is?
His grandfather.
Okay. Well, as I said, I'm going to tell you about America's best kept secret. Now, in the last few years, it's gotten a little bit more publicity because there have been some TV programs. Public Broadcasting did a program about 5 or 6 years ago called The Orphan Trains, and it's on the series that's called, oh dear. American Experience. See, that's why I need you. Now notice I said orphan trains with an S. A lot of people think it was one train that came with a whole bunch of kids, and that wasn't the case at all. This was many, many trains. And they started in 1854, and they continued until 1929. And during that 75 years, over 250,000 children rode trains to farm communities all across the United States. They came to every state in the Union, but the greatest number of them came to the Midwest. This was started by a young minister who was very concerned about the children that were homeless on the streets of New York City and the conditions that they were living under. And so he and a few of his friends that were like-minded decided that they were going to do something about these children. If I back up, maybe I won't squawk. And so that was how they came up with this idea of putting the children on the train. And they chose to take the children to the Midwest or to the farming communities across our nation, because a farmer could always use an extra hand. There was good, clean, fresh air, which there was not in the slums of New York City. And there was plenty of food. A farmer raised most of his own food, so they didn't have to worry about their food supply. These children were orphans or half orphans, meaning that they still had one parent that was living. They were also homeless kids. They were homeless, but many of them had families, but their families could not take care of them. You see, the immigrants came over in great numbers about the mid-1850s, and they were the young families that came over, and they left behind their support group. They left behind the aunts and uncles, the grandmothers, the grandparents that could have helped when the families got into difficulty. And so that was, when they came over here, they discovered that the streets of New York City were not paved in gold as they had imagined that they were. And they also did not have the skills for the jobs that were available. Most of these people came from farming communities in Germany, France, Italy, Ireland, England, and there weren't any farming jobs in New York City. The children that rode the trains were between the ages of infants to 16 years of age. And the reason that the cutoff at 16 was because the children only had to stay with the family until they were 18. And if a farmer was taking a boy to help with the farm work, it would hardly do to send a 16-year-old out that was only going to be there for 2 years. And that was the reason for the cutoff at 16 years. Now the other thing, at this time period, there were many, many orphanages all over the state of New York, but they were filled to overflowing. And so this is why a lot of the kids that were homeless on the streets of New York. Also, these were large families. There wasn't birth control in those days, and so these were quite large families. And when they got over here and father couldn't find work, the older children just had to get out and be on their own. These families lived in tenement houses in the slum areas of New York City. And the homeless kids lived much as our homeless people today do. They slept in cardboard boxes, under bridges. One of the boys said that in the summer he slept up on the roof of the building where his parents lived. There was not room for him in the apartment, so he would sleep up on the roof. Now in the winter time, you might get yourself a nice big piece of cardboard, big enough that you could lay down on. And then you would go down into downtown New York City, and you would find a grate in the sidewalk. The buildings all had steam heat at that time, and the steam heat from the basement would escape and come up this grate. And so there'd be a little bit of warmth coming up out of that basement, and that was a good place to sleep in the wintertime. Also, the doors on the shops were recessed back in, the shop windows were way out in front, and then where the door was recessed back a ways, and that was a good place to sleep. Reverend Brace decided that if he was going to send these children out west to farming communities, that they ought to know how to farm. And so one of the first things he did, he set up a farm outside of New York called the Brace Farm for Boys. And there the boys were taught how to plant a crop, how to harvest that crop, and how to take care of animals. And one of the men that stayed at Brace Farm said that he liked it there so much that when it was time for him to go into New York City and ride the train, he really didn't want to go. He just wanted to stay there with all the animals. Now there were several things that the children did that were homeless to try to earn some money. And one of these was to sell old rags. At that time, the paper that the newspapers were printed on was made of rags, and so they would sell old rags. The other thing they did, they would gather up old bones, because they could be sold in buttons made out of the bones. Reverend Brace also started a home for the Newsboys. If you'll think back to the movies that you've seen that depict the 1920s and 1930s, the children, the boys standing on the street corners hollering, "Extra, extra, read all about it." A lot of those boys were boys that later rode orphan trains. They would go there, they would come there in the evening after they had sold their papers, and they were given a hot meal and a cot to sleep on. And then the next morning, they could have breakfast if they wanted to. Now they paid a little something for this, but not much. But if you were a boy that was really a go-getter, you wouldn't stay for breakfast. You would go right out on the street, go down to the newspaper office, and pick up your newspapers. Because if you didn't sell all your newspapers that day, you couldn't take them back and have the newspaper office give you a refund for the ones you didn't sell. And so the boys that were really gung-ho to get rid of their papers, they were some of the first ones on the street. Now there were several agencies that placed children on the orphan trains, and the two largest ones were the Children's Aid Society, which is the one that my mother came through, and the other one was the New York Foundling Hospital. As I said, the Children's Aid Society started in 1854, and about 1865, the Catholic Church discovered that, heaven forbid, the Children's Aid Society was sending Catholic children to Protestant homes. And they decided that was not going to be the case, and they started their own organization. Now, they did two things that were different. The first one was their building had a revolving door. And if you were a young mother with a child you could not take care of, you could bring that baby, lay that baby in the cradle that was right inside that door, and walk out. You didn't have to talk to anybody, you didn't have to leave a note. Now the other thing that they did that was differently, the Children's Aid Society, when those children left New York, I'm sure the older ones maybe knew where they were headed, but many of the younger ones, you know, they had no idea where Iowa was or Texas. And they didn't know, they had no idea what was going to happen to them. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know whether anyone would take them in. But the Catholic Church, this is how they worked theirs. The priest would announce that at Mass that the train was going to be coming. And if you were interested in taking a child, you were to see the priest after church. Then you could say whether you wanted a boy or a girl, how old you wanted that child to be, and even what color, hair, and eyes, so that child would match your family. Then, when those children came, shortly before they would arrive at the station, the new family that was taking them would have received a telegram the day before saying when the train was coming and what station they were to go to meet the train. Then the children, the day that's just before they would get off the train, they pinned it was a little piece of material, a little piece of percale that had their name, their age, and a number. They pinned the little girls to the underside of the hem of their skirt. The boys were pinned inside their suit jacket. Why they didn't pin them out where you could see them, I don't know. I couldn't understand that. But anyway, I saw one of these about a year ago. Then the couple that is getting that child, coming down to meet that child, they have a similar badge that's pinned to their clothing that gives their name, the name of the child they're to pick up, and the same number that is on the child's tag. So when those kids came in, they were immediately picked up by that family and taken home with that family. Okay, those are the two differences. Now, we've talked about the Children's Aid Society because that's, as I said, the one that I know something about. And the reason I know is that my mother and her two sisters rode a train together from New York to Clear Lake, Iowa in 1912. And my mother never saw her sisters again. The children would come into New York City shortly before they were to ride the train. We aren't sure exactly the time frame on this. I know that my mother's father surrendered the girls to the Children's Aid Society in April of 1912, and they didn't ride the train until November of 1912. Now, some of the children would stay at the Children's Aid Society, and many of the children would be placed with families in New York City that would be willing to take the children until it was their turn to ride one of the trains. They would come in, and the boys and girls both were taught proper manners, and the girls were taught how to set a proper table and how to make a proper bed. And at one of our reunions in Iowa, one lady brought her father's suitcase. It was about this long, about this wide, and about this deep. It looked like a cardboard box in the inside that somebody had covered with canvas. There were 3 changes of clothing, and the clothing that you see up here are the 3 dresses that my mother had when she left New York City. Now, she would have been wearing either the blue checkered one or the pink checkered one, because the good dress she's going to wear on the day she is shown. They had 2 everyday outfits, and they had 1 good dress or 1 good suit, so that they looked just as nice as the other children in that town when those children went to church and Sunday school on Sunday morning. There was not 1 toy or 1 book in that suitcase. that was it. Now, the smallest group of children was a group of 6. And the largest group that I'm aware of that rode the train at one time was 350 children. Now, they rode the train with other passengers, and they didn't eat in the dining car, and they didn't sleep in the sleeping car. They stayed right in their seats the whole time, the whole trip. From New York to Iowa in those days, it took 3 days. And they would plan to leave New York so that they would arrive at the first stop by Thursday night or Friday morning. Because you see, they're going to be shown on Saturday. And that's when the farmer comes into town to get his supplies for the next week. And that way they just had to make the one trip. Now, all this 75-year period, the trains were all steam engines. They took whatever food they could bring with them that wouldn't spoil. They had a visiting agent that rode with the children and was in charge of the children. And then they had chaperones, depending on how many children were going to be riding on that particular train. When you talk to the orphan train riders, there's always one food that every one of them remembers, and not happily. And that's mustard sandwiches. Now, there was no bologna in those. It was bread and mustard. But you see, they could start out. They could bring that with them. If the bread molded a little, it's just going to be around the edges, and you can pick that off and throw it away, and the rest of it's still good. I recently gave a talk in Mason City, Iowa, to a group of 4th graders. And the minute I told that, the whole group started to laugh, and they were pointing to this one little boy. And I said, "You don't eat mustard sandwiches?" And his answer was, "I sure do, and there's nothing better." I'm going to have to tell that story when we go to the national reunion in September. Now, the states that took larger number of children, and Iowa was one of them, it's been estimated, and this is still kind of a guess because we're still finding children that came out of orphanages. We'll get, the national headquarters will get records from orphanages, and so they're still finding kids. But it's been, when I first started doing this, we said 10,000 children came to Iowa. It's now up to 20,000 children that came to Iowa. And because we were one of the larger states, we had an agent. And his duties were to decide what towns the train was coming to. If a town had had an epidemic of a childhood disease like whooping cough or mumps, there could have been a lot of deaths in that town because they didn't have the medicines that we have now. And so that was a good place to have the train come. Then he was also to decide where they were going to show the children. And that had to be, they liked to have a place that had a stage. So it was quite often either the opera house, a school, or a church. Now, on the way out, the children were taught some little songs to sing and some little recitations, so they could put on a little program. Then the agent also was in charge of publicity. The posters that your committee put around your library that said "Homes for Children Wanted," that was the kind of thing that was posted up all around town. And then he picked the prominent committee. And this is how I think some of the children got put into some homes where they never, ever should have been placed. And this is what I think happened. Usually the prominent committee was made up of a school teacher, maybe the town lawyer, doctor if the town had one, and one of the shopkeepers. Now, there are two mercantile shopkeepers in town, and one of them is on the prominent committee. Now, if you want to take a child, you're to talk to the prominent committee ahead of time to be approved or disapproved. Well, here comes this couple that says they would like to take a child. And you're the shopkeeper, and you know deep in your heart they would not make good parents. But they are very good customers of yours, and you think, if I tell them no, they'll just take their business down the street to the other fellow. And so they decide that it'll probably work out. Well, let me tell you, there are some pretty sad tales that some of the things that happened to some of the children, and the boys in particular ran away. There were a lot of boys that was how they could, only way they could get out of it, they thought. Now the children come into town. They're going to stay in a hotel if the town has a hotel, or they will stay with different families in that town. Then on Saturday morning they go down to the opera house and they are seated up on the stage. The visiting agent walks behind each child and tells a little something about that child. But remember, she's only known those children for about 3 or 4 days because she didn't meet them until they boarded the train. But she might say that one little girl had a nice singing voice, or maybe one of the little boys was kind of mischievous and she might mention that. She might say that there are 2 sisters here that would like to stay together. Then, if you think you want to take a child, you can come on up on the stage and really look these kids over. Another thing that happened, quite often there were people that were coming into town, families, to get their supplies for the week. They had not seen the visiting or the prominent committee, and they might want to take a child home, and they are allowed to. Okay. If you're a farmer and you're looking for a farmhand, you're going to want to go up on that stage and feel that kid's muscles. One other thing you're going to want to check out, you're going to want to check their teeth. And my husband, who grew up on a farm, said that that's how you check whether you want to buy a horse or not. But you see, those children had never seen a dentist, had probably not had a proper diet, didn't own a toothbrush. And so a lot of the kids did have teeth that were rotting in their mouths. And one of the ladies told me her story. She said this lady was coming down the row and she was checking out all the little girls' teeth. She was looking for a little girl to help. She ran a boarding house. This little girl was 6 years of age. You think about your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, they're 6 years of age. She said, I noticed as she came down the line, her hands were just filthy. And she said, I silently prayed, please, dear God, don't let her put her fingers in my mouth. She got to this little girl and she said, open up. She said, it took every ounce of my willpower to keep from biting that lady. That lady chose that little girl. Now, they were to have a bedroom, either share a bedroom with another child or have a bedroom all by themselves. When they got home that day, the lady pointed to the sofa in the living room and said, there's your bed. Now, there was a teenager living in the home at that time, and in the middle of the night, she came down and woke up the 6-year-old little girl and said to her, you don't want to stay here. She said, all she wants you for is the work you can do. You'll be helping with the cooking, you'll be changing the bedding, and you'll be washing the bedroom bedding, and you'll be helping with the cooking. She said, if you don't want to stay, I know where the other children are, and I'll take you to where the visiting agent and the other children are. So in the middle of the night, that teenager took that little girl back to where the other children were staying. I often wondered, what did that teenager tell that woman in the morning when her hired hand, her brand new hired hand, was gone? Okay, say you were a parent that decided you could not keep your child. These are my mother's records that I'm reading from. And this is paper that her father signed when he took the girls and gave them to the Children's Aid Society. This is to certify that Viola Volker, who was born in 1907, being a dependent child, was surrendered to the Children's Aid Society. And that meant that father no longer had any say about that child. If that child rode a train, it didn't work out, and she came back or he came back to New York City, and the parents decided that they wanted their child back, you don't get her back, she belongs to us, which I didn't think was quite fair. Now and then you would sign a placing out paper, but before I tell you that, the visiting agent and the children, the chaperones, would stay for several days in that town. And I often wondered, did they keep track of these kids when I first started researching this? And they sure did. The day on Sunday, the visiting agent would rent a horse and buggy, and she would go out and call on all the families that had taken children the day before. If the home was not clean, and that seemed to be a real high priority, the child was taken right now. If the child said, I don't want to stay here, I don't like it, the child was taken back. Or if the foster parents said, this just doesn't seem to be working out, we don't think we can handle this, the child was taken back immediately. Then on Monday, she rented a horse and buggy, and Tuesday also, if there were enough families to call on, she went out and she called on all the families in that area that had taken children from earlier years past. They still called on my mother when she was 22 years old and getting married. They called on her oldest sister until she was 23, and on her middle sister until she was 16 and was married at 16. So they really did try to keep track of them. But this is what happened. You see, the parents, the families that had taken children in earlier years knew the train was coming because there was all this publicity in the newspaper and flyers posted up around town. And if you were a foster parent that was abusing a child, you might say to that child, if you tell, you're going to get it even worse. And so a lot of the kids were just too scared to tell. But the ones that did, or that the visiting agent could kind of figure out something was going on, they were taken out of that home right now. They weren't left there another day. Then if you decided you were going to take a child, excuse me, too much talking today. You signed a placing out paper, and this is, again, is my mother's. And this is what you agreed to do: to care for her in sickness and in health, to send her to school during the entire free school year until she reaches the age of 16 years, and also to have her attend church and Sunday school when convenient, and to retain her as a member of my family until she reaches the age of 18. In case she proves unsatisfactory, I agree to notify the society, and pending her removal, keep her for a reasonable length of time until someone from the agency can come and get her. They also, when they would come to visit, the visiting agent would fill out a report on that child. And as I said, they came once a year, and the families that took the children were to send a letter to the Children's Aid Society once a year saying how that child was getting along. This is my mother's paper when she was 17 years old. I have more of my aunt's records than I do my mother's because some of my mother's records were destroyed when they had a water main break in the basement of the Children's Aid Society. And this is what the visiting agent wrote about Mother. Viola is a lovely girl in person and character, is very small and dainty, and is of sweet disposition. She plans to take business training after she finishes high school. She is a dutiful daughter and is dearly loved by her foster parents. She is taking music lessons and plays the piano well. And she did, the Jorgensens were, as you'll hear a little bit later, were very, very kind to her. And now we're ready for stories. As I said, these are true stories. Lee Nailing was 8, and he had a little brother that was 6.5 years old. And Lee told me that the morning that they were going to ride the train, their father came down to the train station. And I'd never heard that. I didn't even know that. I thought the parents didn't know when they were going to be riding the train. But the reason that he did was because there was a 2.5-year-old little brother that was going to ride with the children. There were 4 children. The mother had died in childbirth with the new baby, and one of the relatives had taken the new baby. And the father thought maybe he could manage the 2.5-year-old and decided that he could not. The father gave Lee a pink envelope that had a piece of stationery in it and was addressed to the father and was stamped. And he said to Lee, "You put this in your pocket, and when you get to where you're going, you write and tell me where you are so I'll know that you boys are okay." And Lee said he very carefully stuck it down just as deep as he could. But he made one mistake. He was so excited about having that envelope that he told one of the chaperones. The next morning when Lee woke up, guess what? No envelope. And he and his 6-year-old brother were down on the floor of the train because he thought maybe it had fallen out in the night. Although he said by then he kind of figured out he wasn't probably supposed to have this. The chaperone came along and she asked the boys what they were doing. And Lee said, "Oh, we're just playing a game." She said, "If you're looking for your envelope, you won't find it." You see, they'd taken away from them. They wanted those children to forget their birth family and bond with the new family they're going to. First of all, if you're 6 or 8 years old, you've got memories of your birth family. And if you've gone to a place where they're not treating you very well, not feeding you very well, and working you real hard, you aren't going to bond with that family if there's not love shown for you. Lee went on to tell that the first family that wanted to take him, he refused to go home with that family. The second family that asked for him, he said yes, he'd go with them. And as the gentleman took him out to the buggy and lifted him up into the buggy, he said to him, "Son, the first thing we've got to do is find you a pony." And Lee said, "I knew then I'd made the right choice." And he said he had a marvelous home. He said he couldn't have had a better home. They were very good to him. The 3 little boys were taken by 3 different families, but in that same area. And of course, the 8-year-old and the 6-year-old were in school together most of the time. But the families allowed them to see one another for birthdays, Christmas, holidays, which wasn't always true in similar situations. For some reason, some of the families just would not let them have anything to do with their siblings at all, even though they were just foster children and not adopted. Then there's Arthur Smith. He's really special to me because I got my mother's records very easily from the Children's Aid Society, but when I wanted my aunts, they said, "No, you can't have them. You're not a child of theirs." And that made me a little mad because my mother had died of breast cancer, and I was concerned how prevalent that might be in her family. And I had never had a cousin. My mother was raised as an only child, and my dad was an only child. Well, at one of the national meetings, Arthur Smith happened to mention to me that he was on the advisory board of the Children's Aid Society. And I told him my dilemma and asked him if he would see if he could get my aunt's records. Well, lo and behold, 2 weeks later, I noticed the mailman trying to stuff this big manila envelope in my mailbox, and I cried all the way to the mailbox because I just knew what it had to be, and sure enough it was. Discovered then what my mother's middle sister's married name was, and that she had 4 children. 2 of them are no longer living, but 2 of them are still alive, and I have been to visit both of them. My cousin Frances, I've been to visit her about 5 or 6 times now. But poor Arthur, well, he'll never, ever know who his family was. He was found lying in a wicker basket, very clean, very nicely dressed, under a rack of ladies' dresses in Gimbels department store. No note, nothing. They estimated him to be about 6 weeks old. As someone told him later, that his mother really must have had a hard time parting with him because she kept him through the Christmas holidays. As I said, he'll never, ever know. He came through the New York Foundling Hospital, and he stayed in a foster home in New York City until he was 6 years old, rode a train to Clara, Iowa, and the family that took him in were very, very kind to him. In fact, he had no idea what his last name was. They'd just given him a name at the New York Foundling Hospital. But he took that family's last name when he, after he'd been with them and was a teenager. He served in the Navy and later became a very prominent businessman in Newark, New Jersey. There are also two governors, the governor of Ohio and the governor of Alaska, that were orphan train riders. So we have some celebrities among us. Then a friend of mine in Des Moines is an orphan train rider. And Clara Romain is her name. She was 2 years old when a family that had 4 boys that were quite a bit older than she took her in. She was not adopted. When Clara was 12, she walked into her mother's bedroom one morning and discovered her mother was dead in bed, or her foster mother. The morning of the funeral, the oldest boy came to Clara and said, "What are you going to do now? You're no longer a part of this family." Well, she stayed, was not paid to do this, but she stayed and she kept house for the boys that were still living at home and the father. And when she was 14, she decided that she could be doing this for some other family and they would pay her to do this. And so at 14, she was out on her own, earning her own living. And then we get to Mother's story. As I said, there were 3 girls and there was a boy. Mother was the youngest. She was 3 years old when her mother died of tuberculosis. Julia was 5, Anna was 7, and William was 9. The father decided that he would keep William. At 9 years of age, William was old enough to have a job in a factory. Now, we don't know whether that was what he did or not, but he could have taken care of himself during the day when the father was at work. The father put the 3 little girls in an orphanage, and he left them there for 18 months. Now, he had to have gone to visit them during that time because they would have been placed on an earlier orphan train if they did not. If they didn't call, a relative call on them at least once every 6 months, then they could ship these children out. When Mother gave me the little dresses that you see up here, in about 1957, when my parents moved from Iowa to California, and I just stuck them away, and then about 12 years ago, I decided that we had a guest room that I decided we were going to use, and I hung these little dresses in that guest room. When I got them out, I discovered there, in addition to the dresses, there was a picture. And I thought at first it was from my grandmother Reed, the other side of the family, and then I noticed it said Brooklyn, New York. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, was written, "The lady in the back row, be on your left, is my mother's birth mother. The heavy-set lady that's sitting in the center is my mother's birth grandmother." Now, it doesn't identify the other 2 young women in the picture, but we are just assuming they are probably sisters of my mother's mother. This photo was taken at the time that she would have been surrendered to the Children's Aid Society. And when that picture came, there is reverse typewriting right down the center of that picture, right over Mother's face. I had never known for sure whether my mother had tried to locate her family or not. My first thought was, how can we get that off there? And my husband's thought was, well, let's find out what it says before we take it off. And here it was a letter that my mother had written to the Children's Aid Society in about 1932, asking where her sisters were. They wrote back to her and said they did not know. And yet, when I got my aunt's records, they were still corresponding with her, with the other two girls. So they could have given Mother an address. The Jorgensens adopted my mother after she had been with them for about 6 months. When I was about 2 years old, the Jorgensens were divorced, which must have been quite a scandal in that day and age. My parents were married in 1929. They were married on Valentine's Day, and the lower picture is my mother and dad on their wedding day. The Jorgensens had lived on a farm outside of Clear Lake, and there was an older girl living with the Jorgensens whose name was Chloe, and she is referred to as my mother's stepsister, foster stepsister. Now, the stories that I heard as I was growing up was that Grandma Jorgensen wasn't able to have any children. Did she have Chloe and then couldn't have any children? Or was Chloe a child that was taken off an earlier orphan train? We'll never know because everybody's no longer living. The little girl in the picture is my mother at about age 6. This lower picture is myself and my two sisters. My parents' 3 children. And this is a newspaper article from the Clear Lake Mirror newspaper. The very first orphan train reunion that we held, there was a gal that belonged to my church who I did not know because the church I belonged to is quite large. And she said, wouldn't it be funny if our parents came on the same train? And she knew her dad had come in November to Clear Lake of 1912. And at that time, we thought Mother had come to Mason City in 1913. And she said, I said, no, I said, that's not possible. Well, she said, I've got lots of newspaper clippings about my dad. The family that took her father and adopted him owned the newspaper there. And so here she comes the next reunion with this newspaper clipping. And here is her father, who was the youngest child. He was 3, my mother and her 2 sisters. And 3 years ago, I had a lady come up to me at a reunion, and she said, my mother rode a train in November of 1912. And she said, I'm trying to find out what town she came to. And I said, what was her last name? And she said, Shoemaker. And I said, just a minute. And went and got this article, and there was that lady's mother and her aunt. There were three families on that very same train. My mother used to say that the Jorgensens took her for the work she could do. She said she had to help with the Saturday cleaning and help with the dishes, set the table and clear the table. And then she had to help with the chicken chores. As I grew up, I look back now, and she thought the Jorgensens took her for the work she could do. We lived in town, so I didn't have to help with the chicken chores, but I did every one of those other things. And I'd give anything if my mother was still alive and I could tell her. Because if Grandma Jorgensen, who lived with us until I was a junior in high school, was even half as good a mother as she was a grandmother, she was a great mother. It's really funny because my sisters and I have talked about this. When my parents got married, and it was the Depression, 1929, and my father didn't have a steady job. He just picked up whatever he could do. My mother had had 2 years of business college, and she was employed as a secretary for one of the attorneys in Clear Lake. And so she had a very good job and was really the breadwinner. And so we don't remember. The only thing we three girls remember is Mother washing our hair, and we hated it. And but it was Grandma that saw that we had our Saturday night bath. You know, we just got one bath a week, and that saw that we brushed our teeth before we went to bed, and got breakfast for us, and got us off to school, and made the most marvelous homemade noodles. There were times when you wished you were sick so you could have Grandma's homemade noodle soup. This little dress I wore to kindergarten for Halloween, and I was little orphan Annie. And I hadn't one clue what that meant, and what was behind that little dress, and what that little dress really meant. Someone told me that this is a beginning tatting pattern, and quite often the older girls in the orphanages would make the everyday dresses for the children and the everyday clothing. This one is partly sewn on the machine and partly done by hand. And the little girl that was learning how to make buttonholes was really just beginning to learn how to make buttonholes.
Button down the back.
Yes, and both of these, when I first got them out, we thought maybe they were like a smock that you would wear over another dress, because this one also was open down the back. But a lady at one of the talks I was giving said that, oh no, she said they had bloomers that matched their little dresses. And you see, I suppose the bloomers, the knees wore out, right? Yeah. And so that's why they weren't saved. But the other thing that makes me think that Grandma Jorgensen must have really loved her is the fact that she kept the clothing all that time. Do you have any questions? I'd be happy to answer them.
What is the name of the grandfather whose descendant is in the audience?
Okay, they want to know what the grandfather, the descendant's name is.
The grandfather that came on an orphan
Yes.
was Harry Hill.
Harry Hill.
You said that your mother didn't see her sisters again, but then you've referred to them. Did I miss something there?
No. The sisters, the two sisters, they knew where each other was. And they also knew where my mother was. Now, the only way this could have been was that the visiting agent, when she would come to call them, would tell. Because, well, I should tell you the story of Julia. Julia, what I said, was married at age 16. The other two girls, the other two sisters, were just shifted around from one family to another. And the reason for this was that they were a little bit naughty. They were very unhappy because the father kept the boy and didn't keep them. And it's written right in the reports that one of the girls was asked to do some outdoor work, and she said, I don't do outdoor work. And you can imagine how long a family would keep a child that was doing things like that. And so she ended up, Julia ended up being married to a prominent farmer at age 16. It turned out that the prominent farmer would drink occasionally, and when he drank, he was abusive, not to the children. Julia and her husband had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. And so when the 2 girls were about 7 and 9, and they were the younger children, Julia and the 2 girls ran off with the hired man. Now, there's a reason, there's an explanation for this. Julia didn't know how to drive, probably. There was only one car. The hired man had probably seen what was going on, and he decided he was going to get the family out of that situation. My cousin Frances, who was a daughter of Julia, told me this, and she said that this hired man, they went to New Mexico, and he did not live with them, but he would come once a week on the weekends to check on them to make sure they were okay and bring them, especially he said he always quite often brought the little girls some kind of little toys or a treat or something.
But the boys stayed.
The boys stayed with the father. Then the oldest girl, she completed 4 years of high school, graduated from high school. She lived with 2 different families, and in exchange for living with those 2 different families, she took care of the younger children in those 2 families. And then she went from there to Dubuque, and she was in a Catholic convent. And we thought perhaps she was studying to become a nun because all through her records, the visiting agent talks about what a religious child girl she is. Well, it turned out that this was a convent for girls, older girls who had no family or no place to go. And they taught them a trade. And she later worked in the hospital in Waverly, Iowa. We know she was married. She had one son, and her husband was shot to death in the driveway of their home. Now, it wasn't, any of the family wasn't involved, and we don't know whether that case was ever solved. My cousin Frances thinks that she remarried, but she could not remember what the second marriage, what the last name was.
But, so they never, the three sisters never saw each other, but they knew.
The two sisters saw one another, but they knew, they were writing back and forth saying, did you know Viola's graduating from high school? Did you know Viola's getting married? They knew all about it. The morning after Julia had run away with the hired man, and I remember this to this day distinctly, we had just gotten a telephone, only had it just a short time. And in that time period, this is about 1935, 36, no later than that, about 1938, the telephone rang on a Sunday morning, and it was long distance. And this man asked for my mother, and he said, do you know where Julia is? And my mother said, Julia who? And he said, well, your sister. And mother said, who is this? And then he told her what he wanted, and mother said, I have no idea where she is. She said, I have not seen her since I was just a tiny girl. And that was Julia's husband. Mm-hmm.
So he knew too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he knew too. Any other questions?
Do you have any idea if there are potential ways to find the names of children who were in a Catholic orphanage that burned?
Is this in Iowa?
No, my husband's grandfather
Oh, okay.
came from
Give me your...
orphanage in New York.
Oh, okay, and
And I'm thinking potentially there is a way to find.
Yes, and let me tell you, a lot of the orphanages that burned didn't burn. That was just a way of not being able, that they didn't have to give people records. They also had there were a lot of them that had a flood too. In fact, it really tickled me because when I got my mother's records, because they said there weren't very many records because they had a flood in their basement, and I thought, oh yes, I bet you did. Well, when I wrote the second letter and asked for them to send all her records, then they sent me several copies of things that had really been destroyed in the flood. There maybe be, on a whole sheet of paper, maybe 7 or 8 words, but they were strung out so you couldn't, and the rest it was, the ink had just blotted and run. So they really did have a flood. Anybody else? You see me afterwards.
When the child didn't work out in the family and they were taken away, were then they placed with another family?
Sometimes they were. In fact, Anna made the mistake of the first night that she was in the first home, she told them that her mother had died of tuberculosis. Well, let me tell you, when the visiting agent came the next day, that family said, we don't want her. And the visiting agent went down the road and found a family that would take her. And of course that one didn't work out either. She was about 7 different homes, Anna was, and Julia too. And Julia was in one home for 2 years and she just loved it there. It was a farm family that had her. You had your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to know about the authenticity of the book Orphan Train and the movie that was made on TV in the 80s.
Okay.
And you know what you thought of it? Have you met any of the characters?
Yes.
In the book? Did it differ?
I haven't seen it for a long time, but yeah, there are some writers whose stories are in that movie. And yes, that was very true to life. In the very, very early years, they rode boxcars. And they would stop at the siding, and the kids would just get off and line up along the railroad tracks, and the people would come in and pick them out and take them home. And then as time went on, it got a little more sophisticated. So by the time my mother rode in 1912, the story that I've told you, that's how it worked then. And that, yes, that movie was, there have been several, I can't remember, it's a Sunday morning program, because we found out, we got home from church and we had about 4 telephone messages asking if we'd seen this program on television. And it was just a short, about 15-minute segment on a Sunday morning news program. And that was very true to life, too. Any other questions? Uh-huh. All I knew was that this little box of dresses, they were my mother's dresses. And I knew that she was born in New York, and I knew she rode a train, and I knew that Grandma Jorgensen was her adopted mother. And I knew she had sisters and a brother somewhere. And that was about the extent of what I knew.
Did they ever find or get in touch with the brother? Or?
The brother came to the Children's Aid Society in the mid-1920s and asked where his sisters were. They told him they didn't know. And they were still calling on all 3 of the girls.
Why were they so
I don't know. By then Anna was of age. And I just can't understand that. Especially, I don't know why they couldn't have told him where the 2 girls that had never been adopted, where they were.
Did the people who adopted these children, did they have to pay
No,
these children?
no, they did not.
There was no money?
There was no money exchanged, and they didn't even have to pay for the child's train fare. I'm told that they were asked to, but this very seldom happened. And it was the wealthy people in New York City that paid for the children's train fare. They were also the ones that paid for the children's good dresses that they were going to be seen in. Last summer, my husband and I were in Clear Lake visiting, because I lived there till I was 12 years old. And we were standing across the street from the movie theater that I went to as a child. And I was telling about, how much we paid for the Saturday matinees. And all of a sudden, the 2 of us looked up at the top of the building, and here etched in the stone is Opera House. And in the newspaper article, it says the children were shown at the Opera House. And so that same movie theater that I used to go to see the Saturday movies, my mother had been up on that stage as a little girl and was picked from that bunch. Mm-hmm.
Were there enough agents to take care of the little ones on the train?
Yes, they had chaperones so that, it wasn't like a one-to-one basis, but yeah. Uh-huh.
Were those volunteers?
I think they were. I haven't been able to determine that yet, but it seems like maybe they were. I know the visiting agents were paid, but it doesn't say anything about the volunteers being paid. Mm-hmm.
What happened to the children that weren't picked?
Okay. After the visiting agent they stayed in that first town, and after the visiting agent had made all her calls on the new families that had just taken children and the families that had taken children in previous years, then arrangements had already been made. They would board another train, and they would go on to the next stop. Now, once in a while, they would get to the end of the line, to the end of that trip, and a child they might still have a child. And so then that child would go back to New York City with the visiting agent and then ride a later train. But think for a child, how terrible that would be.
I read somewhere that a visiting agent that covered Iowa, he and his wife took many of these leftover children.
Reverend Clark?
Yes.
Yes. He has a new book out that is just marvelous. I should give the library the book list I have. His children he kept a record of all the children that he'd brought back from New York City, brought out to Iowa, because he was the agent for Iowa. And they're listed by towns, and he names all the children and even has pictures. And he must have been a marvelous man, because the children, you can just tell from the things that he tells about the children that he dearly loved them. This book just came out a year ago this spring. And last summer, we had an Iowa reunion over in a little town of Delmer, Iowa, which is over in eastern Iowa. And the night before, I'd been reading this book. And we used to live in DeWitt, and one of the chapters is titled DeWitt. And so I had read that chapter the night before, and this man came up to me and he said, I'm trying to find out where my father ended up. He said, I think it's DeWitt, Iowa, but he said everybody else in the family thinks it's Makokata. He said they say there wasn't a train that came to DeWitt. And I said, just 1 minute. Went and got my book, hadn't even told me his father's last name, and this man's aunt had also ridden a train. And guess what? There under DeWitt was his dad and his dad's sister. He was so tickled. Well, that was supposed to be my book, but I sold it to him. I figured I could get another one.
Have you ever done a presentation with somebody in the current foster care system, or compared the current foster care system to the orphan train?
I haven't given a talk, but I have, in the 1950s, we lived near a family that took children in under foster care. And there's a great deal of similarity. There are some good experiences, just like there were with the orphan train, but there's also some of the kids are in situations they shouldn't be in. And to me, the foster care kids, well, kind of like the orphan train kids, they're moved around too much. You know, sometimes they're just shifted one family, and some of the families, those families are receiving money for keeping them. And so for some of the families, that's the only reason they have them, is that income. Anyone else?
Do you know what year the train stopped in Fairfield?
No, I don't, but I'm gonna, we have the Iowa reunion, Dick and I are hosting it again this year. That's the one that we said we'd do once. This is our 9th one. And I said, I'm not doing it next year. But I said that last year, reminds me.
They started to stop it.
Yeah. And I might be able to find, from Madonna Harms, she might be able to tell me what years. But no, I don't. And oftentimes you see they came back to the same town a few years later, same community.
Do you have a website?
Yes, you see me afterwards. There's an Iowa website, and there's also a national website. The Iowa website is brand new, way back there.
I just want to make a comment because I work for Human Services, and I know there's some foster parents in the audience too that there are still some not good situations in foster care at times. But I hope we've made some improvements since 1962. We had in the mid-90s, the Adoption and Safe Families Act was passed, and that requires that when children are in foster care for a year, there has to be some kind of a plan made for permanent plan for the kids. So a lot's changed just in the 25 years that I've been involved. I used to see a lot of kids drifting from home, and some still do, but not as bad as it was.
Oh, that's...
We have a real big need for foster parents. There's still kids out there that need them. So there's a lot of really great foster parents out right now, just like you talked about some of the people.
Yeah, some of the people that took.
Wonderful experience.
Yeah, you know, some of the kids said, and especially the boys will tell you, the men will tell you that if they had stayed, even though they didn't have the best experience in the world, if they had stayed in New York City, they might have been. They really felt like they would have become part of the criminal element of the city. I might just tell you that the reason it was stopped was because there were national laws passed that you could not take children across state lines for purposes of adoption. And also, about that same time, there were instituted some programs by the government that allowed families to keep their children together. And that was the reason that it stopped at that time. We've been a great audience. We had no idea how many to expect, and I see we're almost overflowing the room. And that's wonderful. If you want to do me a favor, share this with your grandchildren, because these are the ones that are going to carry this on and let people know what happened. This is probably the biggest migration of children in the history of the world. Thank you all for coming.